Our speaker this afternoon is Arif Ullah, and Arif is the executive director of Anthropocene Alliance, which is a nonprofit. It's a nonprofit EJ and policy and advocacy organization that also is known as A2. You can see this on the screen. Arif is a longtime community organizer and advocate in New York City. As director of A2, he oversees sort of the management and of operations and sort of strategic development. And so A2 is basically a boundary organization that connects a network of hundreds of grassroots organizations across the country that are focused on things like flooding hazards and pollution hazards. And on the other side, sort of philanthropic organizations and state and federal agencies that are looking to empower and support these groups. So today, this presentation is titled Environmental Justice in the Time of Climate Change Denial. Please welcome me in welcoming Arif to speak.
All right, thank you, Eric, and sounds like my mic is on. Real pleasure to be here with all of you today. Just a note on what you can expect. My presentation is comprised of 4 acts, and each act has a particular theme, and then the final act is, of course, dependent on you and your participation. Another note is that I have kept editorializing to a minimum, so everything that I'm sharing with you is fact, but please feel free to fact check me on anything that I say. Okay, Act 1, setting the context. In the last 14 months, we've witnessed a dramatic and deeply consequential shift in federal level environmental and climate policy in this country. A shift in priorities, approaches, and protections for communities facing environmental injustice and the escalating climate crisis. Let's see, I want to make sure. Okay, we came from what was the largest federal investment in environmental and climate in American history, the Biden-era Inflation Reduction Act and the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. The investments were historic, though it must be said, still not enough. They represented investments in renewable energy, environmental justice initiatives, emissions reductions for power plants and vehicles, and stricter particulate matter standards. And particulate matter is especially important to under-resourced low-income communities that are disproportionately pollution burdened, because this is the air that we're breathing in, causing a number of health issues. Also, we saw stronger enforcement of the Clean Air and Clean Water Acts and formal acknowledgement for the first time by the EPA of grave environmental injustices happening in communities across the country. There were other meaningful highlights of environmental progress, and I should say that much of that progress was without question the result of many years of advocacy by environmental and environmental justice organizations. So yes, there were good people working within the Biden administration that enabled it, but that progress really would not have been possible if not for, I would say, the decades-long efforts of environmental justice organizations. Among the highlights was the EPA Journey to Justice tour launched by Michael Regan, who was the first EPA administrator of color, the first Black person in that role. The tour was a multi-day affair through Mississippi, Louisiana, and Texas in November of 2021, places that had suffered decades of toxic pollution with little federal attention. The EPA also established a new Office of Environmental Justice. There was an Office of Environmental Justice before, but really this new office placed a lot more resources and staff, as in fact 200 plus staff across all 10 EPA regions. The EPA, as you might know, is comprised of 10 regions across the country and territories. And so these regions received infusion of environmental justice staff to solving environmental challenges in under-resourced and underserved communities. The White House established the White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council, and these were people who had been doing environmental justice work for a long time. These were not technocrats, and but again, people who had been doing the work, who have been on the front lines of environmental climate justice work. And they were, this council was formed to provide advice on addressing current and historical environmental injustices. And the White House Council on Environmental Quality, which had existed, became more active in advancing environmental justice. Justice 40 was another important initiative. It set a government-wide goal that 40% of the overall benefits of certain federal climate and clean energy investments must be directed to communities that have been marginalized, underserved, and overburdened by pollution. It covered more than 500 federal programs across 16 agencies. So I'm focusing really on federal level type policies because that's really what I'm going to transition into in a little bit, and then, with Act 3, really focus on what groups on the ground, grassroots groups, are doing to advance environmental justice in this new climate. So I don't mean to suggest that a lot of the progress that we had seen pre-2025 were just at the federal level. That's just my focus for this presentation. But getting back to the Inflation Reduction Act, through funding from the IRA, the EPA launched the Thriving Communities grant-making program, $2.8 billion through regional grant makers directly to community-based organizations working on environmental justice. Separately, it launched the Community Change Grant Program, which allocated $1.96 billion for community-driven local climate action. These two grants were the single largest investments in environmental justice in US history. But I don't want to also paint too rosy a picture, though even if the IRA was important, it certainly wasn't all catching and entirely comprehensive. There were still plenty of shortcomings. Environmental injustices continued, including the IRA's expanded support for what's known as carbon capture and sequestration, which is considered by EJ groups to be a false solution to addressing the climate crisis. And drilling projects continued to be approved by the Biden administration as well. Pictured here is the Willow Project in Alaska, which essentially was an $8 billion oil drilling project that the Biden administration allowed to happen even with the IRA. The Gulf of Mexico lease sale is another example in which the Biden administration auctioned off 73 million acres of federal waters in the Gulf of Mexico for oil and gas leases. All right, moving on to Act 2, the rollbacks. So the setting for Act 2 begins in January 2025. Since then, in just over 1 year, we've seen progress that took decades to build, shattered, dismantled, and maligned. The rollbacks are not subtle. They're sweeping and deliberate. On April 8, 2025, President Trump held a White House event promoting what he called beautiful, clean coal. Coal, again, I'm sticking to the facts here, right? That's a quote. Coal is, in fact, the dirtiest of fossil fuels. I think many of us would agree to that. A driver of toxic air pollution and the climate crisis. The methane released by coal mining is a super pollutant, 80 times more potent than CO2 over a 20-year period. Just a few weeks ago, the Trump EPA, under Administrator Lee Zeldin, a very different administrator than Michael Regan, officially revoked the endangerment finding. This was a really, really important and consequential finding. It essentially was the scientific and legal cornerstone of all U.S. efforts to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. It formally determined that greenhouse gas pollution endangers public health and welfare, and it served as the legal foundation for EPA regulations on climate pollution from cars, trucks, power plants, and beyond. Administrator Zeldin, EPA, and here you see that Scott Pruitt is pictured. This is the first Trump administration. Some of you might remember the administrator then as Scott Pruitt, but it's pretty much the same, except the EPA is more of a polluter's agency than it was in his first administration. Anyway, Scott Zeldin has described his work, and I quote, as driving a dagger straight into the heart of the climate change religion. This is a quote from the head of the EPA. Remember the EJ grants that I mentioned just a little while ago? Well, please just forget about them. They no longer exist. In February 2025, shortly after the administration declared that environmental justice was no longer an EPA priority, it terminated the Thriving Communities Grant Program, and shortly after that, it terminated the Community Change Grant Program. My organization before A2 was a grassroots environmental justice organization in the South Bronx, and we had submitted one of these community change grant applications, and we were actually a very, very strong contender because we had received one of these coveted technical assistance awards to help us prepare the community change grant application. We were submitting an application for $20 million to create a coastal resilience plan for our part of the South Bronx. That would have been transformational for this section of the South Bronx. And again, I think we would have gotten it, but of course that grant program was canceled and it was not to be. Some groups that had actually been announced for a grant, that money was also canceled. And then there were some groups that had received money and that money was taken away. So a few $1 billion of grants authorized by Congress for air and quality improvements, child-led poisoning prevention, community air monitoring, and clean energy in frontline communities, among other things, revoked, canceled, vanished. What's more, the EPA acknowledged it was terminating essentially every grant program under the Environmental Justice Office. According to the Environmental Data and Governance Initiative, the canceled EPA environmental justice grants represented $6.4 billion in economic opportunity and an estimated 65,000 jobs, with the economic impacts distributed roughly equally between Republican and Democratic congressional districts. Right? So there was no sort of plot to direct all of this funding into simply Democratic districts. And in fact, a lot of that funding was going to Republican districts. So on the topic of the EPA Environmental Justice Office, please forget about that too. It no longer exists. Founded in 1992 and surviving Republican and Democratic administrations for over 30 years, it's been permanently shut down. Staff were fired in waves, and all 10 regional EJ offices were shuttered. Also, across the federal government, words and phrases, as you might know, have been systematically removed or flagged for elimination from agency websites, official documents, research, and grant agreements. PEN America, an organization that some of you might know, has documented more than 350 targeted words and phrases. The list includes climate change, so climate change is no longer in any official government documents, environmental justice, clean energy, safe drinking water, pollution, equity, Black, Indigenous, underserved, and many, many more. These aren't just words. Their erasure reflects a deliberate strategy to make it harder to name and therefore address these problems that communities face. But it gets even better. In September, Trump issued what's referred to as the National Security Presidential Memo 7. Some of you might know about that. It's titled the Counter Domestic Terrorism and Organized Political Violence Memo, Countering Domestic Terrorism. So the memo authorizes the FBI's Joint Terrorism Task Forces to investigate, prosecute, and disrupt nonprofits, activists, and their donors and funders, labeling opinions it considers anti-American, anti-capitalist, or anti-Christian as potential indicators of domestic terrorism. So if you fall into any of these categories, you might be listed or considered a domestic terrorist. And environmental organizations are certainly part of that. They were named in this memo as examples of that. So moving briefly to the international level, and I know that this is a review for many of you, but I think it's important to just remind ourselves of this. And I'm not even going through the comprehensive list, right? But moving briefly to the international level, on January 20th, 2025, Trump's first day in office, he signed an executive order to withdraw the United States from the Paris Agreement for the second time, calling it an unfair, one-sided ripoff. The withdrawal formally took effect just this past January. Additionally, for the first time in the history of UN climate talks over the last 30 years, the United States sent no delegation to COP30, held in Brazil in November. Some say that might have been a good thing and that there was some progress made that maybe wouldn't have been made if the U.S. were there, because it would have served an obstructionist role. But it's still something worth mentioning. Trump also ordered withdrawal from 66 international organizations and treaties, including the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change and the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. All right, there are still more, lots more of these rollbacks, but below are just a few. Zeldin proposed slashing the budget of his own agency by 55 to 65%, gutting the agency's enforcement capacity. A sweeping executive order directed the Attorney General to stop enforcement of state and local climate and EJ policies directly targeting state-level progress. Chemical plants were given a pass to pollute. Companies can now request Clean Air Act exemptions via email. Vehicle and power plants emission standards were eliminated following the endangerment finding reversal, and so on. So in short, things have gotten really weird. The official position is now essentially climate change is the, and I quote, greatest con job ever perpetrated on the world, according to President Trump in his speech to the UN General Assembly in September 2025. If you haven't seen that speech, I would encourage you to watch it. It's long, but there's a lot in there. Bans on toxic chemicals have been halted, allowing the continued use of products found to cause cancer, birth defects, and developmental disorders, among other ailments. The EPA has overhauled how it evaluates toxic chemicals. I don't know if you know, but their chemical safety office is now headed by former executives of the chemical industry. And so, that's not very surprising. Disproportionate pollution burdens on communities of color are not worth addressing anymore, according to the administration. Trump revoked a 30-year-old executive order requiring federal agencies to reduce disproportionate environmental burdens based on race and class. The EPA has proposed that greenhouse gas emissions from fossil fuel power plants do not contribute significantly to dangerous air pollution. So fossil fuels are not dangerous. And destroying species habitats also is not harmful to them. So what I mean by that is through the Endangered Species Act, unless you are actually killing that animal, if you do harm to their habitat, that's not considered to be harmful to them. That's what's that they're working on right now. And of course, lastly, 2 + 2 = 5. I couldn't resist the Orwellian reference. I mean, this is all just kind of surreal to me, at least. All right, Act 3. We keep fighting. So what I just described is what we're staring in the face right now. It's bleak, it's overwhelming, it's upsetting, and it feels disheartening, especially given how hard and long we've worked over the last decades, really, on every bit of progress that I had listed at the outset of this presentation. All of that has been wiped out. But communities on the front lines, we don't have the luxury of grieving about it. We keep fighting, we keep organizing, we keep advocating, and pushing for better. And that's because we have to, because our health and lives are what's on the line, and because we know that if we don't defend and protect the earth and ourselves, we'll be the ones who are wiped out next. So the work continues. So even if the term environmental justice is banned, it remains our goal. Race and class should not determine whether a toxic facility gets sited in your locality. People of color and low-income communities should not disproportionately bear the destructive consequences of the fossil fuel economy. Everyone, regardless of zip code, income, and the color of their skin, deserves equitable access to a clean and healthy environment. This picture, I snapped this picture in Reserve, Louisiana. It's a town that's between New Orleans and Baton Rouge. It has and we're going to talk a little bit about this in a bit, but it has the unfortunate nickname of Cancer Alley. Y'all might have heard of that. That's an oil refinery in the background. And literally, in front of that oil refinery is an active graveyard, right? And so that really tells the story, right? There is a community, these are known as fence line communities, that is just right up against these massive polluting facilities. All right, so getting back to A2, this belief that, the foundation of everything that we do at A2 is supporting grassroots groups on the very local level. We bring together, support, and organize along grassroots groups across the country to fight for environmental justice, to fight for environmental protection, to fight for environmental health. We work with communities that are most directly impacted by the pollution, by the flooding, by the wildfires, by the excessive heat, and the cumulative impacts of climate change by providing organizing, capacity building, policy, research, and nationally coordinated advocacy support. Nearly all of our 430 plus member communities spanning every US state and territory are grassroots organizations established by the people who are immediately experiencing the issues and the environmental injustice. Most are small, either volunteer-led or just a few staff. So given the collapse of the federal environmental leadership that we just that I just presented on, A2's focus on local and state policy isn't just practical, it's strategic. State and local policy can address flooding, air quality monitoring, siting restrictions for polluting facilities, cumulative impact analysis, in environmental permitting, renewable energy standards, zoning, and much more. So the point is that a lot can happen on the state and local level, even with the federal government, and all of these rollbacks and cancellations, revocations. There's still a lot that can happen on the state and local level, and A2 is privileged to be positioned to be able to work with these grassroots groups to advance environmental justice campaigns on the local level. So, for example, the U.S. Climate Alliance, a coalition of 24 governors representing approximately 55% of the U.S. population, again, lifting up the local, has pledged to reduce collective greenhouse gas emissions by 50 to 52% below 2005 levels by 2030. These states represent about 60% of the U.S. economy. In New York, a campaign led by environmental justice groups, including my previous organization, an A2 member actually, resulted in the passage of cumulative impacts legislation in 2022. There was a speaker last year who spoke about the cumulative impacts legislation in New Jersey, and New Jersey was the first state, so you all carry the props there to pass cumulative impacts legislation, and New York State really learned a lot from that. So this landmark law requires that New York State agencies consider the cumulative impacts of pollution on quote-unquote disadvantaged communities before issuing environmental permits. In plain terms, agencies can no longer approve a new polluting facility as if it were the only source of pollution in the area. It has to take into consideration what other polluting facilities are in the area. So that was historic. That was a landmark piece of legislation. And again, New York became only the second state to enact such a law. All right, so I want to highlight a handful of additional local environmental justice efforts that A2 is supporting our members on. Every single one of these efforts illustrates the power of grassroots community organizing and how that can really make a difference in bringing about change. Let's start in Gloucester, Mississippi. Just some background. Gloucester is a small majority Black town in rural Mississippi with a population of fewer than 900 people. Its county ranks highest in the state in cardiovascular disease. For over a decade, residents have lived with noise, dust, foul smells, and heavy truck traffic from a large wood pellet factory operated by Drax, a British energy company. The plant grinds wood into fine sawdust, compresses it into pellets, and ships it to England, where it's burned for electricity, marketed as green renewable energy over there. This corporation has received some $13 billion in UK government subsidies. But advocates on both sides of the Atlantic have called it what it is: British government subsidizing environmental racism in the United States. This is not green energy, really. So Greater Greener Gloucester is an A2 member group, and it's fighting back. In September 2025, we connected the group with 6 other grassroots organizations across the state to form Mississippi Grassroots United, coordinated and staffed by A2. Their first joint effort opposing Drax's application to increase its allowable pollution levels initially succeeded, only to be reversed when the Mississippi Department of Environmental Quality granted Drax the permit anyway. When the department held its evidentiary hearing, Mississippi Grassroots United resisted. They showed up and they continue to push back against the unjust policies that they're essentially being subjected to, and their health and the health of the wider community continues to suffer. But again, that hasn't prevented them from continuing to organize. And I want to make a point about that. Organizing is a long-term effort. It doesn't just happen. A campaign isn't just launched overnight. Organizing is a lot about relationship building and by organizing, we're also creating long-term power. Right? All right, so now I want to jump to Black Hills, South Dakota. The Black Hills over there are sacred land to Lakota people. And they've been exploited for mining for generations. Gold, uranium, and now lithium. 1 in every 5 acres in the region has an active mining claim. Most US lithium, cobalt, and nickel reserves are located within 35 miles of Native American land, a Native American reservation, meaning that the batteries powering our phones, laptops, tablets, electric vehicles are being built in large part on indigenous land. The Black Hills Clean Water Alliance, an A2 member, has been monitoring and challenging a new wave of lithium mining operations. There are 9 exploratory mining operations that are happening right now in that area. The group has been sounding the alarm about mining companies emphasizing the green and quote-unquote green energy narrative. That's what these mining companies are emphasizing, the green energy narrative, right? While downplaying the environmental destruction and community harm in how they operate. This campaign raises an uncomfortable but essential point, right? Every one of us with a phone, laptop, etc., is connected to this supply chain. And the rush to secure lithium for all of these devices and now electric vehicles shifts the environmental burden from cities and consumers to rural indigenous communities where the resources are mined. So this transition to the clean, to renewable energy, this quote-unquote just transition, it has a cost as well, right? And it's important that we recognize that. And those same communities are the least likely to benefit from the green transition. This is what advocates call green colonialism. The Alliance's goal, this group, their goal isn't to stop the green transition, but to demand that, quote unquote, do no harm be a first principle of it, to push for greater battery efficiency. So yeah, we have these devices, but how can those devices be made to be more efficient? Improved recycling, right? Real recycling, and not recycling that is sort of, really instigated by by big oil, right? We know that that's a big business too. And reduce consumption, right? We don't talk about that enough in the United States. We don't talk about reducing our usage of electricity, reducing our consumption. It's more about like sustainable this and that, but like what are our consumer habits, right? So that's what they're really pushing for as well, reduce consumption, so that the transition to clean energy doesn't simply replicate the same patterns of exploitation that the fossil fuel economy has perfected. All right, so let's move to Seattle, Washington. Let's move to Reserve, Louisiana. Reserve, Louisiana, which was what we were talking about just a little while ago, was identified by the EPA as having the highest cancer risk from air pollution of any census tract in the United States, driven primarily by chloroprene emissions from the Denka performance plant. So Denka is a large corporation based in Europe. Chloroprene is a known carcinogen. And we already talked about this being the reason why the area, unfortunately, is called Cancer Alley. The history here runs centuries deep. The land beneath these petrochemicals, chemical plants, is the same land where the ancestors of today's residents were enslaved. Okay. Though a different era, lives continue to be destroyed. So Concerned Citizens of St. John, a community group, an A2 member, has been fighting relentlessly. The group filed a lawsuit against the Louisiana Department of Environmental Quality and the Department of Health in 2022 that led the US Department of Justice to sue Denka in 2023. And in May 2025, Denka announced it was suspending production indefinitely. So it shuttered its operation. And that was a direct result of the years of community organizing. Again, this type of campaign takes a lot of time. But that was a direct result of years of community organizing in the area. A victory for sure, but the damage has been done too, right? And damage will continue to be done for a generation. And these cows that you see here, grazing in this toxic area, like that's not only impacting these animals, but like we're consuming the meat and the products from these livestock as well, right? But in any case, this was a big victory, and that needs to be celebrated. But now with the Trump administration having closed the EPA's EJ office, canceled the EJ grants, and also canceled and vanished a lot of tools that environmental justice organizations were using, including what's known as the EJ screen, data screen, basically giving organizations the data to strengthen their advocacy efforts. All of that being vanished, communities like this one have lost critical federal assistance. But again, the broader battle for Cancer Alley is far from over. Okay, now we're going to Seattle. The Duwamish River runs through the industrial heart of Seattle and has been designated a Superfund site since 2011. Over a century of urbanization and industrial activity left the riverbed contaminated with PCBs, arsenic, lead, and other toxins. The communities along the river, particularly the lower Duwamish area, are mostly people of color, immigrants, low-income folks, refugees, and Native Americans. And they have a life expectancy 8 years shorter than the Seattle citywide average, combined with a poverty rate of 21%. The Duwamish River Community Coalition, an A2 member, has spent over 2 decades pushing for the Superfund cleanup, community health monitoring, and in partnership with the University of Washington and the NIH, an indoor air quality monitoring project tracking pollution exposure inside residents' homes. As a result of their efforts, in late 2024, sediment cleanup construction finally began, which is a major milestone. And early cleanup efforts have already reduced average PCB contamination in the riverbed by more than 50%. And once all of it is removed, PCB contamination is expected to be reduced by over 90%. And the full cleanup will take about 8 more years. All right, moving to South Carolina, Vermont, and Pennsylvania, and focusing now on PFAS. PFAS is everywhere, as you might know. It's in every product that we use, unfortunately. It's known as forever chemicals, and it's a class of more than 15,000 synthetic compounds, again, used in everything from cookware to microchip manufacturing. They're in our kitchens, our devices, and even our clothing, right? Among many other things. And they're linked to cancer, thyroid disease, immune disruption, and developmental problems. They accumulate in human tissue and don't break down in the environment. Some are classified as carcinogens, as I just mentioned. A2 members, the Winyah Rivers Alliance in South Carolina, the Vermont PFAS Military Poisons Coalition in Vermont, and the Move Past Plastic group in Pennsylvania are fighting a major regulatory gap. There are currently no requirements preventing industries from discharging unlimited amounts of PFAS into public wastewater treatment systems. No regulations preventing them from doing that. But those systems were never designed, these wastewater treatment systems were never designed to remove PFAS, right? So while the chemical industry profits, the public pays for this, not just with money, but with their health and their lives. Testing by Winyah Rivers Alliance found that the Sumter, South Carolina wastewater plant, which receives PFAS-contaminated water from several facilities and chemical plants, showed a 107% increase in PFAS concentrations downstream, a 107% increase. Further downstream at a local lake, state testing found PFAS levels as high as 7,600 parts per million. So for context, adverse health effects can occur at just 2 parts per million. And what they found was 7,600 parts per trillion. 2 parts per trillion, right? I should note that PFAS PFAS-laden sewage is often spread on farmland as fertilizer. Okay, so that's another way we're getting PFAS, right? Ending up in both livestock and crops. So the demand that these A2 member groups are making is pre-treatment requirements that shift the costs of PFAS removal from taxpayers and downstream communities to the industries generating the pollution. The technology exists to do this. PFAS can be removed, and so does the legal authority, but what's needed is the political will. Okay. It's worth noting that most of the campaigns I described are happening in red states. So we work with a lot of groups. A2 works with a lot of groups in red states. And some deep red. I really want us to resist the notion that environmental progress can only happen with Democratic elected officials. So it's not just that Democrats are the ones who are doing good by the environment and by environmental justice communities. Let's remember that big oil has been able to thrive under both political parties for many decades. They've been enabled by both political parties for many decades. And when A2 and our members organize, we don't lead with the language of climate change. We don't knock on doors and tell people, have you heard of climate change? You should be worried about climate change. We talk to people about the problems they can see, smell, feel. The petrochemical companies causing devastating rates of cancer, that's what we talk about. The flooding destroying their homes. The contaminated water their children are drinking. These are all things that people can agree on, regardless of political party, right? Everyone can agree on wanting to breathe clean air and live in a healthy environment and be able to thrive in those environments, right? And so when we do organizing work, we're leading with what I call the symptoms of climate change and hopefully get people to see that they are in fact the symptoms of climate change. But we don't lead with the fact that we are in a climate crisis. Okay, Act 4, this is where we need your support and your involvement. And I think I've done well on time. We're going to have a discussion. But before we get to that discussion, I don't want to miss the opportunity to ask for your ideas and thoughts on how we, A2, can do our work even more effectively and strategically. So crowdsourcing your ideas. And if it doesn't happen now at this moment, we don't have a whole lot of time for discussion. But if it doesn't happen now, I'm going to include my information in a bit. But get in touch with me. But think about these questions and share with me your ideas, thoughts. There are ways that we can be collaborating. There is a role for academia. We're working with research institutions on some projects, but certainly well-resourced institutions like Princeton can be doing more, and I think we can agree on that. So we don't have to answer these questions for the discussion, but I just want to put them up there for now. You can address this right now, but really I want to be able to talk about anything that I covered and your thoughts on that for the next few minutes. So thank you for listening.
All right, questions for Arif? Student questions welcomed first.
Yeah, please go.
Hi, Arif. Thank you so much for your presentation. I'm Natalie. I'm one of the PhD students with Eric's lab. And it's really interesting to learn about how DJ movement evolved with the different administration. And I think one of the points that you mentioned about how oil and gas has been funded by different administrations, even before Trump. So I wonder if the strategy of the DJ movement has changed, given that this administration is even more radically supporting fossil fuel industry. But I mean, fundamentally, it's the same fight. But is there something that we can do even further in order to counter that extra momentum pushing for the support of fossil fuel industry?
Yeah, and it's a David and Goliath type story, right? I think that the focus on local level changes is an important one. Again, highlighting the fact that there is much that can be done on the local level. So I raised the example of the cumulative impacts legislation in both New Jersey and New York, right? That would really be impactful for many other states and frontline communities across the country, right? So what are these ways that state level changes can be made? One other example is we've seen an emerging issue over the last year, right? I think last year at this time, there was very little in the news about AI data centers, right? I think people who were clued into it and in that world were aware of it, but now it's very much in the mainstream news. We've seen it emerge because the communities we're working with are playing host to these AI data centers. Some of these, and many of these, are the size of college campuses, right? Massive, and have very few jobs, right? And very few benefits. No regulations, unchecked, right? And so we're working with communities, again, as an example of what can happen on the local level, and I think the real need to focus on the local level to first and foremost have a moratorium so that we can come up with regulations, ordinances, legislation to be able to enact good strategies for these AI data centers. We don't think that they're going to disappear, right? But what can we do to make them more responsible? So I think in short, what I would say is really continuing to focus on the local. And in terms of the federal level, we do have an opportunity right now. I talked a lot about the EPA. And yes, during the Biden administration, the EPA had improved, the best it's ever been, right? But it wasn't perfect, right? And there were still so many more improvements that could have been made. So what can we do now to envision these agencies like the EPA, like the Department of Energy, to create blueprints so when there is a new administration, and even further down the line, we're not scrambling at that moment, but rather we would have taken this opportunity right now to have created those blueprints so that we can hit the ground running and start implementing those changes right away. So that's another thing I think we could be doing. Any other thoughts or questions? Yeah, go ahead.
Hi, I'm Raymond Witherspoon. I'm also in Eric's group of first year PhD student. I was wondering if you could speak a bit about collaboration of various entities, but in particular, the role of science and X, so science and storytelling, or science because I do a lot of research on environmental impact statements, and I have some fundamental forms of a lot of the ways things are measured and concepts are described, but there are also limitations from, I guess, the technical side of the equation. And often the technical side of the equation is not talking in tandem with the lived experiences or the community knowledge. And so I'm wondering what that's looked like in your experience, and if there are ways that we should be trying to find other languages, other resources, other ways to bridge that knowledge, because I feel like that's still a fundamental gap in this space.
Yeah, and I was talking a little bit about that with your classmate Vivek this morning. There is that huge gap that exists between academia, research, data analysis, and communities, but we need to be working together. That's a fact, and I think it's as simple as listening and what like approaching groups with what do you need, right? We, particularly smaller groups that are stretched thin, we don't have communications teams, right? And for us, telling the story is very important, but weaving in hard data and science into those stories strengthens our advocacy and makes it more appealing to a range of other players, including funders. We need funding to do this work, right? Including government officials. We need that political will, right? And so I think being able to distill sometimes complex data, complex research into compelling and accessible stories into accessible visuals, right? I'm a big fan of story maps and accessible and compelling talking points, maps, right? All of that, all of those things are very, very important to the work that we do. But I think doing it in partnership and with community groups and making sure that they're the ones who are really leading the project and the collaboration is how to make sure that what you produce is in fact what is needed by those groups. But thank you for thinking about that. And again, the resources that you all have are very, very important to us. And we want to be able to work together, but there has to be a benefit to us as well. Yes.
Hi, Shelley Hoover, also with Eric's research group. I was wondering so I saw the executive order that effectively labels EJ as domestic terrorism.
Yeah.
Have you seen any actions taken against EJ groups, and if so, and if not, like how are you all preparing for that potential action against environmental justice groups?
Yeah, I mean, what I've seen is sort of like the negative image of that in some ways, where I've seen EJ organizations remove their staff pages, right? Whereas, you had faces of staff and their emails, et cetera, like suddenly that's gone, right, as a preemptive measure. I have seen some organizations removing the language that's considered incendiary, right, which is sad, right? I'm not saying that this has happened with all organizations. And I think larger organizations that are in the spotlight are probably feeling more sensitive to that, and at the same time, I think that they should be actually acting more boldly and resisting, responding more boldly. But I've seen organizations that have also crumbled because their funders are now a lot more hesitant to fund environmental justice work, right? And so those are the ways that I've seen this executive order, and also, I mean, before this executive order, there had nonprofits had been under scrutiny for the previous 2 years for, I think, reasons that you might know, and those organizations were also operating in this sort of climate of fear. But I worry that more and more of that will happen, and that will have a profound impact. At the same time, I think like Rose by any other name will smell just as sweet. Like we can continue to do environmental justice work, and you can call it what it is, right? But I think words are powerful too, right? And so we begin to disappear words and ban words, and that has a profound impact on what we're doing. So, but thank you for that question. Yeah.
I am. I'm not with Eric's.
You can't ask the question then.
I'm a postdoc in Michael Oppenheimer's group here. Thank you so much for your talk, and thank you for your work, which I think is really, really important. I had a question about, you talked on the national level of the discourse that we've been hearing against climate change and climate science, for example. Have you been seeing the effects of this polarization at the local levels as well? Because you mentioned that I think many people can align on the fact that more clean water, clean air, et cetera, but have you been seeing more pushback at the local level or more difficulties in community organizing because of this push at the national level?
Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned science, because science, of course, under assault too, right? Like so many agencies have gotten rid of their science staff, right? Including at the EPA, but Department of Energy, National Science Foundation, et cetera, right? And I think the impact of that is, and we've seen data sets disappeared, right? Like entirely disappeared, right? And thankfully there are organizations like the Open Environmental Data Project that have rescued, some of these data sets, right? But those data sets are important to the work that we do, right? And so even if communities aren't in, a lot of cases being directly impacted, right? There is a lot of indirect impact that's happening, and some of that impact will also happen, not in the immediate short term, but also, in the midterm, really. And and possibly in the long run. And so how communities are being impacted right now indirectly is that the science, the analysis, the research that we had gotten better at weaving into our work, right? Because, and I say we had gotten better because it wasn't always the case that we were weaving. We had gotten to a point where it's like, okay, we saw how this data, this analysis, this research really enhances our work. We had gotten to that point, and now that suddenly was disappeared. So we had gotten better at it, and now we're facing this challenge of like, well, what do we do? These tools are either gone or will be gone. And so what we are doing is beginning to now look at other types of partnerships like the Open Environmental Data Project, like partnerships with academia and other institutions, so that we can continue that work. But it's a real challenge. When science is under assault and questioned, the science of climate change is questioned, right? That leaves us with a real huge challenge. If you have any thoughts on it and insights, please share with me too.
All right, that's kind of there for now. I spoke with Arif earlier. He said if you have any other questions, we'd be happy to take them up individually. Did you sit here and put your...
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yes. So no, not that one. A lot of remote controls up here. So feel free to get in touch with me at that email, and I'd be happy to hear from you. And thank you again for listening and for just being interested in this very, very important topic and the work that you all are doing.